All right, we got another great episode with the Brooklyn Nets making too many moves to count for one episode. Had to stretch it out over the course of this week. Doug, hit us with the beats.
Oh, yeah, we're going to get into the Paul Millsap signing, talk about LaMarcus Aldridge coming back, get a little bit into how these guys are going to sort of end up moving some of the roster situation pieces around as well. It's a packed one. That's making too many moves to count, buddy. Yeah, it's just it's one of those things with the team right now.
If the Nets weren't long enough, they certainly got that covered. Now we're going to break it all down right after the theme music.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Brooklyn, yo. All right, welcome back to the Locked On Nets podcast on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. Over there is Doug Norrie, DFS expert, DFSR. If you're looking for all those daily fantasy rankings, got you covered for baseball right now, NFL kicking off in just days, my friend. And I am Adam Arbrecht, talking Brooklyn Nets, and of course, covering the New York Football Giants on the One Giant podcast as well. Doug, how are we doing as we I don't want to like beat the drum here too heavily when we say, oh man, what are we going to do in the offseason? Is there going to be enough to talk about? Like the Nets just always hear that episode and they say, all right, we'll make a move. The guys want to make sure they get the people what they want to have. And we got more great players to talk about as the Nets bring in Paul Millsap and a familiar face in LMA.
Yeah, this is again the holiday weekend for not for the Nets. I guess they get most of this done before the weekend started. So yeah, yesterday's podcast we talked a lot about the DeAndre Jordan trade and what that sort of meant for the team, what they sent out, what they got back. We knew that we didn't really want to pile it together with the Millsap piece because it was just frankly such a busy time that that it warranted its own episode. So if you didn't listen to the DJ piece, head back over there and listen to that. The Millsap thing is really interesting. Another one that I just simply didn't think was going to happen if you based it on what you were hearing from at least the Millsap camp, which was he wanted like sort of mid-level exception money, and we just knew the Nets didn't have the money, at least prior to the DJ trade, didn't really have any real world mechanism to be able to get him like that because of how far they were over the tax. But then I guess that went out the window because he signed for the veteran minimum to come to the Nets, and it's just another great signing. Yeah, he's older, but this roster now at this point is so damn deep that we talked about the last episode. They're so deep we don't even know they're gonna have to cut somebody that you can kind of maybe have been a little excited about at one point. They're like, one of these guys is not going to be on the team because Millsap, from all accounts, is going to vie to start at times for this team. At least that's what he was told, according to some reporting, that there's a chance that I don't think it's probably going to happen, but that there's a chance that he has a starting role when it's all said and done. And it probably is one of those things where even if it doesn't start at the beginning of the season, something will happen during the course of the season where injuries or blah, blah, blah. We'll probably end up seeing him in the starting lineup, which is another great signing.
Yeah, well, when we talk about the idea of, you say, minute shares and stuff, LMA, we're going to get to him a little bit later and what the expectations are for him. When the Nets brought in Blake Griffin, what were the expectations about how many minutes you want a player like that working? You can go inside of Millsap's numbers and see that over the last handful of seasons in his career, he's come down to be a mid-20s kind of minutes guy. So I think all of this talent is going to say, we talked about this over the last couple of years, who's starting? Well, it may be in name only, not so much about what's the most important lineups for closing out games, etc. I had done the emergency podcast when they signed Millsap. I wanted to get your take because just on the surface, when I looked at Millsap, what I really saw was like it's just a model of consistency. His entire career is incredibly consistent from the field, from three. And then when you talk about what you get in a player on the offensive and defensive end, I just think that what the Nets saw here was an opportunity to bring in a guy that offers an incredible level of reliability. And that's a little bit different than where they came from, say, with DeAndre Jordan, knowing that reliable, but not where you need him to be. And then even a young player like Nicholas Claxton has all this upside, but you don't know if you're going to get consistency from him.
Yeah, so one thing that we talked about with the Nets and how they've gone about constructing the roster, especially over the last year plus, is that the value of having veterans on a championship level team really ends up being so much more valuable than to most other teams, because you're not worried about the little mistakes that these guys, you're not having these guys learn it on the fly, right? Like they're not like, this is what we saw with Blake Griffin. He's not learning schemes or just general basketball stuff on the fly. The pressure is not a big deal to him because he's been around the league so long that these are just not the things you're going to sit there and sweat out about whether you have it or not in a certain player. Tends to be around guys if you have them when they're young. In terms of your role players, like having these guys as your role players is why it's so important to have, X stars that have now embraced a role player role are incredibly valuable to teams like the Nets, because you just don't have to worry about it. You don't need to worry about the professionalism, all this stuff. Like there's lots of little boxes that get checked by bringing these kind of guys in. And Millsap's just another one of these guys. Is he at the level, like the all-star level that he at once was when he was sort of like with Atlanta and after he had come over from Utah? No, of course not. He was basically out of the playoff rotation for the Nuggets by the end of their playoff run last year. That's okay, because the Nets aren't asking him to be a 30-minute a game wing that takes on huge scoring loads and rebounding loads. So that's not going to be what he's asked to do. He's not a proxy for Blake because they play different ways, but he can do things. He can play small ball 5 here. He can shoot the 3. It was down a little bit last year. He was 2 years ago. It's 44% from 3, though. I don't think that's coming back. Only 2.5 a game. But he can step out from beyond the arc and not be a 0. He's been basically a 34% 3-point shooter for his career. He is a good defender. He can score if you need him to. The Nets will probably not ask him to score that often. I just thought it was a great signing. To get him at the minimum is such a win. It's like you can start to see why other teams in the league or other fan bases would start to be getting a little angry with what's happening here, even recognizing that this is not Paul Millsap from 6 years ago, who was really, really good. That's not this version of him. But if you look at how this team is being constructed now, if you're a fan of anyone else, you're kind of like, what's going on here? The veteran minimum for this guy?
Right.
This is crazy. These guys, but when you're a winning organization, it's super advantageous for these guys late in their career to come over here, because this is ring chasing. He doesn't have one, and this is your best chance. And if he's made tons of money and that mid-level exception money wasn't going to be there, then, and you told you might have a chance to start, like, why wouldn't you come to this team?
Well, and by the way, too, because I think you're right. It's like other fan bases looking, going, come on, this guy could still be X, right? But then when you really think about it, if you're one of these young teams or that's up and coming, well, Paul Millsap, and we said this before about a lot of players, the same thing with Blake Griffin, like Paul Millsap isn't nearly as valuable to a team playing 35 minutes a game who's trying to get into one of the playing game scenarios possibly, as opposed to what he means to the Brooklyn Nets. So I think sometimes we do think about the reconstruction of the league, and then the super teams form, and all these guys want veteran minimum contracts to go, chase rings. But it's also because they are getting older, and your best value is in a smaller sample size. The more you play me, the more likely it is that you expose what some of my deficiencies are and where some of my weaknesses are. So that's where I think there's a little bit of a difference between what other fan bases say that are in smaller markets or aren't one of the teams vying for a championship versus the reality of how they would feel if they had this player on their team. And then just to double up there, when you talk about the defensive upside, and you mentioned Blake Griffin, I think the versatility that you get now adding in Paul Millsap by Raider standings, veterans do drop off. He's been a plus the last 3 seasons, plus 2.8, 1.4, 1.7, specifically on the defensive end, and essentially gives you net neutral on the offensive end. And what you like about things like that is every player that comes to the Brooklyn Nets from an offensive standpoint is going to benefit because you have these superstars on the team. So all your looks get better for you. They get a little more opened up. So you always think that end of the floor can get a natural uptick. The defensive side is where you want to kind of be able to lean on players like this to step up instead of the superstar for some possessions. And that's what I think Millsap can do for you.
Yeah, totally. Like playing with Jokic is a pretty good place to be also.
I did have it in the back of my mind. Right. I was like, now he wasn't coming for the worst scenario as far as opening up his offensive game, but.
Right. Yeah. So it's like, I think they're pretty optimized there in terms of offense and how they run things, but it's fine. Like this is just what you're getting. He might be the best defender of those 3 guys, of the 3 older guys that they basically have now. He probably is. He's a little smaller than that group, but that's okay. He's a smaller in terms of height. He's an absolute load. He is old. He's 36 years old. So I want to make sure we pump the brakes on about like where we can get excited about his upside. I don't think there's tremendous upside in a guy like Millsap, but that's, again, this is not, if he's the 8th guy and Paul Millsap's you're right, something like that. We'll break down the roster later in the week about what we think it's going to be, but that's probably where he ends up. If Paul Millsap's your 8th guy, your team's awesome. right?
I'm,
Like
I'm almost
that's
36,
just the only
Doug,
way
and
to
I feel
put
like
it.
I'm just
And
entering my
by the way,
prime. So
oh, you look it too. And if you're watching on YouTube, you'll see that Adam's entering his prime. Make sure you're subscribing over to the YouTube channel also. All right, we're getting a little more into the Millsap here. Talk about Aldridge as well. First, got to talk to you about our friends at Sweatblock. If you've been dealing with Sweatblock, excuse me, not been dealing with Sweatblock. If you're dealing with sweating, then you need Sweatblock. And I've been through this kind of stuff. You're up in front of people. You're worried about what shirt you're wearing. You're worried, you're going on. I don't go on dates anymore, but back in the day, be worried about the date a little bit. If the sweat was going to show through the shirt, I'm giving a presentation as well. Maybe you got to throw an extra shirt on top of it because you're just worried about something getting through. Take all that worry off your plate when you start to use Sweatblock. It's stronger and more effective than most clinical antiperspirants. You put it on at night, you go to bed like you do every single night. You wake up, you just wash up, shower, you're good to go. No more sweating. It's absolutely guaranteed. It can sound too good to be true, but once you use Sweatblock, you're not going to go back. Once or twice a week, and you're good for the whole time. No more picking out shirts based on which one's going to hide the sweat better. If you or someone you love is dealing with it, check out Sweatblock right now. Go to sweatblock.com, grab 20% off if you use the promo code Locked On, or you can head over to Amazon or CVS. They have it there as well. But help us out by going to sweatblock.com, grab 20% off with that promo code Locked On, sweatblock.com.
And if you're tired of getting killed by daily fantasy sports experts, don't play the experts, play the house with Stat Hero. Here's how it works. You go over to Stat Hero where they'll show you their lineups and dare you to beat them. It's you against the house in a head-to-head fantasy matchup. You name the stakes, winner take all. You have the advantage. Stat Hero is showing you their lineup ahead of time. No one else does that. I wish Doug would show me some behind the curtains of how he prepares himself for the day. But he won't. It's all a secret, and I just have to see him come out looking like a gentleman. You can go over there and get everything that you need as you're in total control. Stat Hero's DFS is the way it was meant to be, one-on-one. Play Stat Hero now and change the odds. Go to stathero.com/lockedon, sign up for free, and right now you can get 3 times back on your first play. They're giving you 300% match. And that is unheard of course, as we say. Go to stathero.com/lockedon, stathero.com/lockedon.
All right, so I have a question about like and we'll get to Aldridge here in a second, but what you were saying about Millsap before, maybe start to think about where the market is for these guys later in their career, right? Because if you were the Orlando Magic and you spent a mid-level exception on Paul Millsap, the Magic fans would be like, well, what the hell are you doing? Like, why? Right.
Yeah.
And he would also never go there. So I totally get it. But do you think we're in this version and if this like small windowed version, and this is why we're seeing it happen with the Nets and frankly, the Lakers too, where I sent out a tweet the other day about how many former All-Stars from like 2014 or like there's like 9 guys that were All-Stars in 2014 that are on one of these two teams right now. So, and 2015 was basically the same thing. It was the differences. And by the way, half the All-Stars from that year just out of the league. And then almost all the rest of them are on the Nets and the Lakers. Do you think we're just in this very weird, like championship or bust window with some of these guys? And there just happen to be 2 teams that are so far above the rest because this is sort of unprecedented. And Paul Millsap is just another example of this, of like how this team construction, we've really kind of never seen this happen before. And I'm wondering if you think it's a blip because of just who happens to be on these 2 teams, the Nets and the Lakers, or do you think that this is sort of what ends up kind of happening going forward? Because it is a very weird situation.
Yeah, and I think I'll say blip because it's going to be very rare that you end up with an opportunity to have Kevin Durant, James Harden, and Kyrie Irving like that. Those level of players we talked about it before. Where do they rank in the hierarchy of best players in the league? Fine, hit you with the numbers. It's a pretty elite group. Out there in LA, wherever Russell Westbrook is, he's probably he is the lowest among these 2 teams. But you have LeBron James, you have Anthony Davis. Like, there's a lot of things that have to coalesce in order to make these type of situations and teams happen, and then offer opportunities for veterans to want to come and play there. So, market matters. It's not just about a team that has enough money. Like Oklahoma City could have enough money. Doesn't mean they're bringing together a group of stars like this. And obviously, Golden State had their run of time with this. I think it could bubble up again in another handful of years, but you need the highest level, most elite players to want to go and play with one another. It's not just an automatic that these guys are all on the same page and like one another's games and like each other off the court, etc. I also think that if you want to take, I don't know if this is a negative view of the league, but there's certain demographics of players. There are, like Millsap, LMA. These guys were at the top of their game at one point. But there are the elite of the elites that are basically going to be incredible their entire careers until they retire. Then there's all the young players that want to make a name for themselves and get their paycheck. And then there's guys that are great championship level contributors that are going to play their way through some pretty nice teams. Maybe they'll be there for a championship, maybe not, but they're never going to be the last, the key figure in any of those runs. That's what I think. You look at Millsap's career and where he bounced around from. I think he's had a lot of opportunities to maybe be a part of something like that, and it hasn't worked out for various reasons. This, I think, is the way that the league is maybe always kind of been constructed, even if we didn't realize it. And this season is giving that example of, if you're a veteran guy of a certain skill set, you want to trend towards the better teams. You don't want to be playing it out, making a little extra money after you've cashed a lot of your checks. And you do want to have that last thing, a championship ring, before you retire.
Yeah, and I think that's what we're seeing it. And I agree with you that it's probably a blip, but it's something that can probably be cyclical too. At some point, it can, or it can kind of ebb and flow. We're at a very interesting sort of inflection point with where the NBA is right now in terms of superstar talent and how it's basically coagulated, come together on these two teams in a way that we just haven't really seen before. And we kind of saw it with the Warriors, but that was just one team, and they were kind of set with what they were doing, right? Like they were so much better for that run that they were on, basically, than everyone else. And they were adding some
and drafted players, by the way, too, right? Like their core was a collection of drafted talent. So I think that built in a different way.
Yeah, exactly. And so they weren't. I know some people are going to call this like mercenary sort of like signings, because and I guess by the very definition that would be sort of correct, but it also, when you're 36 years old and you only have a few more bites of the apple, like where else are you going to go? That's why Paul Millsap was only considering a few teams. Warriors were one of them. Nets were another one. And yeah, he's still going to ask for the most money as possible. But if another team like the Blazers, right? I'm not saying the Blazers weren't in the hunt here, but if the Blazers come calling, like if you're Paul Millsap, you might say, yeah, I could do that. Maybe I can make a little more money. Blazers just a random example, but I can maybe make a little more money, but for what, right? Because I'm not gonna put them over the top, and they're not there right now. So I can kind of see the writing on the wall how this is going to go. So at that point, the Nets make a lot of sense. And it's just so funny about how many guys this has worked out for the Nets for now, right? With Blake and Aldridge and Millsap, and not really Patty Mills, but kind of, right? Because that's a little bit different. But all these guys now just coming over, twilight of their career, they're on the downside of the curve, but still plenty left in the tank for what the Nets need them for. And now, like what I said about them adding Millsap, now they're just completely loaded up.
Well, and it is that weird thing of like, no, you're valuable. And it's like we said on last episode about DeAndre, like you're valuable. You're just valuable at a very specific price point. And then I think it's just about decision making. And if you're any of these veteran players, you just have to look at it and say, I mean, it's your choice, by the way. You could go cash another couple of checks, or you have an opportunity to win a championship. And I think and by the way, these guys we're going to get to LMA here in a minute. These are guys that have accomplished a lot in their careers, where it makes it easier to approach this opportunity later than maybe some other guys who still feel like they have things they want to prove individually.
Oh, for sure. And getting these guys, even at this point in their career, is just so like, I'm going to beat this drum all season. You're going to see this all season. We saw it with Blake. Having the veteran guys that you just know can step in and be contributors that are going to be, and Blake played a totally different version of himself than he played other points in his career. He was sort of like the, young scrappy, get it on the floor, mix it up with the other guys and kind of be a little bit of a heel. And it works perfectly. I don't think that's going to happen with either of these two other guys at all, because they're just different personalities and that's just not how their games go. But it doesn't matter, because you're bringing in these veteran presence that are just they're just time tested. Has Paul Millsap won a championship? No, but some of that just kind of comes down to a little bit of luck, right? Those Atlanta teams he was on were very, very good, really good regular season teams for a long time. They happened to just also be in the East when LeBron was in the East. And if you it's like one of those things. It's like, oh, did you make it to the championship when you were in this year? Were you on LeBron's team? And then it just goes right to no, right? And so if you're on LeBron's team, it goes to yes. And you say if you weren't on LeBron's team, you didn't get to the championship. And that's where he was with Atlanta. And then with Denver, did they get close? No, but they were, East or Western Conference championship close, and that's getting pretty darn close there. So this is a guy that we know can sort of play at these levels. And I just think it's one of these things, like I said at the beginning, I just find it to be so funny that we're in a world where the Nets, it's funny, going back to that podcast we did, I did 2 weeks ago, where I just talked about the Nets roster turnover over 2 seasons. Yeah. And one, if you didn't listen to that podcast, the cliff notes are there's one guy from 2 years ago on the team, Joe Harris. Every single other guy on the team is totally different at this point. So you're just rooting for a whole new cast of characters. But and the Millsap thing kind of put the button on this. But if you had 2 years ago said, hey, the Nets are going to have Kevin Durant, James Harden, Kyrie Irving, Paul Millsap, Patty Mills, Joe Harris, LaMarcus Aldridge, Blake Griffin, you would have thought like Oklahoma City and like Orlando folded. Right? They just like 2 teams just got wiped off the map, so they had to reconfigure the league a little bit because we have 2 fewer teams. There's no other way that
guys on the court at a time now. That's how we changed the whole scheme here.
If you put that list in front of somebody 2 years ago and said, and Millsap was really where I finally kind of hammered home to me, you would have thought that the league contracted. There's no other way. The talent level for this team right now is just is totally unprecedented.
No, it's also that thing too, I think, perceptually, right? I mean, we're going to get to LMA, obviously the health concerns, but even a guy like Millsap, like it feels like we've always talked about this, guys that have names, like Blake Griffin was this when they got him on the buyout, right? You're bringing in a name, and we were pumping the brakes to everyone saying, this isn't Blake Griffin Lob City days, it's going to be something different. Now, he found a great role for himself, but I think sometimes when you were big enough, when you were good enough in the league to have a pretty high profile, then as you do start to get older and your game does start to regress a little bit, or you're going to settle into a more support role, all the perception, right? The perception reality of who these guys are and what they are, again, is influenced by. So when you say 2 years ago, right? All of these guys 2 years ago, you'd be like, holy cow, watch out. Now, still very dangerous, but very much a different version of what that would have been if they all met up in Team X 2 or 3 seasons ago, when you felt like these guys still had a lot left in the tank and starting minutes left in the tank.
And I kind of mean that, and I know what you're saying, and it's just mostly like these are right. They're all still just names, right? We knew they weren't all going to retire.
Yeah.
These guys weren't on the retirement track. They're just kind of getting a little older. It's just so funny that they all landed. They're all going to be in Brooklyn now. Okay, I'll get a little Aldridge talk here in a second. First, talking about our friends over at Rock Auto. Look, you've been to a local car place. When it comes to buying car parts, they have a computer. You have a computer. They type in the make and model of your car. You can type in the make and model of your car. They just go to a drop-down menu looking at the parts. You can go to a drop-down menu looking at parts. What I'm getting at here is do not go to those local places. Go to rockauto.com. You're doing all the same things they're doing over there, except you're going to get 30, even 50% better prices at Rock Auto for all your car part needs. It's a family-run business. They've been serving doing-it-yourselfers for over 20 years. Reliably low prices for every customer. You don't have to know someone in the local joint to get a better deal. No, you're just getting good, reliably low prices over at Rock Auto, and they have everything you need for your car or truck: brake parts, tail lamps, motor oil, new carpets, everything you can think of over at rockauto.com. All you have to do when you go to rockauto.com right now, see all the parts available for your car or truck, and then write "Locked On" in the "How did you hear about us" box, and they'll know that we sent you. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need. rockauto.com.
And so, listen, we're going to be curious to see how Paul Millsap fits in, and we're going to get into that over the course of this week, because now rotations and rosters and what does it mean for guys we maybe were higher on last year, all of a sudden they take a very much diminished role. On the other side of it is a guy that, well, you mentioned it in Blake Griffin being a guy that reformed himself when he came to Brooklyn. Paul Millsap isn't going to reform himself in Brooklyn. He's going to be the same player that he was, I believe. Likewise, LaMarcus Aldridge, when he first came over prior to retiring and having the health concern, he said the reason that he was attracted to Brooklyn was because Sean Marks and Steve Nash said, we want you to come in and play your game, which is a game and a style that is maybe aging out of the league, but he liked the fact that he was going to be able to do what he does well and not be asked to become something different, because I don't think he's capable of it. We can get into that, I guess, in a second. How surprised were you that he ends up coming back? I guess that's probably the biggest piece is he ends up getting cleared and makes the choice to come back after what really felt like a difficult but comfortable decision for him to say, I'm not risking my health to come back in and, play another season or two.
Yeah, 1 year contract, $2.6 million is what Aldridge signs for after getting cleared. I think we talked about it here. The second I heard that he was cleared, I was like, he's going to be a net. I was convinced of that one because I think you were too. It just seemed too obvious. He had all the talk around how all the stuff that he had said afterwards, directly after having the heart issue come up and knowing that he had to retire and how painful it was. He was nothing but complimentary about how supportive the entire Nets crew was for a thing that was clearly disappointing for them, because that he came in right away and start. Remember, if you go back to last year when they signed him, it was a done deal that he was going to Miami by all reporting. The reporting had said he was headed to Miami basically, and then it pivoted right away and he went to the Nets. And I think it was part of what you said about what Mark said. And then they said to him, you're going to start here, right? You're going to come in and you're going to start. You're going to be the starting center, because he started right away. He played 5 games, started them, played really pretty well. But as soon as I heard that he had been cleared, I was 100% convinced that he was going to be a net, because I just thought, like, where else would you go? He was so complimentary of the team. He knew it was going to work. He knew he had a role there, especially too, if he was worried about something else happening again and knowing they were going to be supportive of it again. Nothing else made sense. So I would have bet big money from the time we heard that he was medically cleared. If you had the ability to bet this somewhere, I would have bet a lot that the Nets would have been the team, because I just thought it made just too much sense that he was going to end up being back in Brooklyn.
Yeah, too much goodwill, too much positive experience to say, and now I'm coming back and I'm going to explore the open market. And he understands where he is in his career as well. The interesting thing, I think, would be that after the scare and the addition of Millsap and the way that this roster looks, now you had Blake Griffin there last year, but Blake Griffin has identified this new role. I wonder what the conversations were between Sean Marks and LMA, and kind of saying, are you earmarked to start? Well, maybe it's going to be a flexible role. Let's just live inside this reality that we're bringing you in. As we said, we're going to get into the full scope of the roster, but specifically just around the new additions. I wonder if LaMarcus also came in kind of saying, and to your point, if something did pop up, I feel like Brooklyn kind of comes in with open eyes saying, if something happens, we're fine if you end up needing to retire again. But when you do walk back in the door, it may look a little bit different than what expectations were last year. Because I think even then, the Nets didn't know what Blake Griffin was yet, and you didn't know the other pieces that were going to fall over the course of this offseason. So it probably takes a little bit of pressure off of him as well. Like, you get to come back in a place that felt comfortable last year, and the expectations aren't going to be as high as they were last year for you, where they said, you're coming in to replace DeAndre Jordan and to be the center for us as we go on a championship run.
Oh, right. Exactly. And again, we didn't know what we were going to get out of Blake at that time. He was coming off the bench. He clearly was not told he was going to start when he came in. He didn't start when he first came in. So that was not part of the expectation. The Aldridge thing, like I said, he played 5 games, started 5 games, was good when he played 13 points, almost 5 rebounds a game. Didn't take a ton of threes, which I thought was a little surprising based on sort of how he'd been trending a little bit over the last couple years in San Antonio, but that could have just been small sample size. Still was taking 10 shots a game, was able to get into the block, and he's obviously a pretty good scorer. He's got a nice, really nice fadeaway, just really high release. He's kind of hard to defend down there when you have him one-on-one, especially with a smaller guy. So I think we kind of see that role again. I think you're probably correct in the assessment on how the conversation looked this time compared to last time. They're just at a different point in time now with where the team is, especially with the front court. He's the last of these guys to come in, right? Because Blake's already there. They signed Millsap first, Blake was there, Millsap first, and then Aldridge is the third one. So he knows that it's at least more crowded now. And the fact that we saw what we got from Blake in the playoffs means that at least to start, Blake deserves to walk in as the starter based on what happened last year. You would think, just from an optics standpoint, you would think that you would say, hey, especially if we're not worried about the games early on in the season, you really were great in the playoffs for us and exactly what we needed at the time. And that earns you a starting job out of the gate. And we'll kind of see how it goes. And maybe it's going to be matchup dependent. And we want to keep everyone healthy. And so we're going to see a lot of minute shares here over the course of a season, because I think that has to be a real operating point for the Nets. So yeah, it will be interesting to see how it plays. I'm sure we're just going to know based on sort of like training camp and stuff like that too. The Nets, I think, will be sort of forthright with how that's going to play out. Questions about the other guys, the younger guys, I'm not sure, but I think at least for these three, I'm sure this had to have been talked about.
And funnily enough, for LaMarcus Aldridge, for Millsap, for Blake coming back, for all these guys, again, the one thing that will seem familiar to last year is, how do these pieces all fit together? Like, and it was different guys. We're talking about getting Kevin Durant back on the court last season, but the Nets are probably still going to go through some of that aspect of, okay, what works best? What are the combinations that we like the most? And how do we maximize? Just like we did with Blake, how do we maximize the value of these veteran players and also balance it over the course of an 82 game season and make sure that the biggest value comes in the playoffs? So I think, we've talked about all this turnover and trying to find the right pieces that fit. It's going to be interesting to see how training camp and the start of the regular season plays out to say, how long will the Nets go into it before we feel like we have a real sense of defined roles, defined expectations, and then it's just saying, now let's get through healthy.
Yeah, and the health has to be the major concern. I think you have to worry a little bit about player development. We're definitely going to talk about this later in the week, is that, so while we've been cheerleading all these moves, and we're on board with every single one of these moves. These moves are great. Millsap, A+ signing, getting Aldridge back, total A+ signing, getting off the EJ's contract. Somehow they did it, total A+, right? So all these moves have been great. One thing we haven't talked about the last couple episodes is what happens to some of these young guys, because we've been wanting to see extended runs out of Nick Claxton. We're going to spend almost maybe a whole podcast talking about this. What happens to Nick Claxton now? This is like a big question. What happens to Daron Sharp? Where there's only 240 minutes in a basketball game. I mean, there's 240 player minutes for your team. You have 240 minutes for an NBA basketball team to fill for your 5 players. That's not enough to develop some of these guys along any kind of realistic timeline. So it's just gonna be something that warrants a longer discussion, but there's real question marks around these young guys now, specifically Claxton. I'm not sure what his future is. And so that's for another day, but it's going to be interesting to see how some of that stuff starts to play out.
And because he's the guy that had big minutes last year, as we know, he's going to be the first name that we get into. But then even where we started following the draft and all this young talent, that now looks very different once you add in all these other veteran players as well. So as quickly as you analyze one possibility for the season, we now need to add in this other layer and figure out, in a very positive way, as you said, how the Nets manage all of the different expectations and development across the board.
All right, we're going to get out of here. Like I said, we'll be back later in the week talking more about the Nets roster construction. The combine those letters
I don't
together.
think the Nets would have played as well in my eyes. This would have been an attractive spot for a lot of these stars.
In the meantime, a couple things you do to help out the podcast. First, subscribe to our YouTube channel. We're going to have all of our episodes going up on YouTube. The link will be in the show notes. So make sure you go over, check out our mugs over on YouTube. Like I said, every single episode will be up there as well. Make sure you like and subscribe there. Leave a review. Numbers have been stayed really strong over the off season. Just a really, really exciting time here in Locked On Nets between the YouTube, the numbers, all of it there. And we're really appreciative of everyone that's been listening and jumping on new as well. The way you help is you like and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts.
The Brooklyn Nets have gotten older and better this offseason. I look forward to being older, when what you look like becomes less and less an issue, and what you are is the point. Susie Sarandon.
Oh, one of the all-time great poets. We'll be back again later in the week talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.